What if the creature you thought was a threat was the only one who ever told the truth? In the middle of the scorching desert, where secrets are buried deeper than bones, a wounded bobcat shows up with a military badge in its mouth and a look in its eyes that says it remembers everything. What happened in the sands 5 years ago was never meant to be found, until now. The desert's silent witness. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to hear your corner of the world. It started on a wind-blown Tuesday. Margaret Lane, a retired military nurse, was pouring her second cup of black coffee when she spotted movement near her front porch. At first, she thought it was a coyote. But what limped out from behind the mesquite wasn't wild in the usual sense. It was a bobcat then, bleeding and dragging something wrapped in dusty cloth. Margaret didn't scream. She stepped outside and whispered instead, "What happened to you, friend?" The wind howled like an ancient ghost through the arid plains of southern New Mexico. Dust swirled in lazy eddies across the cracked earth, brushing against the faded clapboard siding of a lone house nestled just outside the quiet town of Dry Creek. The sun, heavy and low, cast long golden streaks across the sand, while the scent of sagebrush and warm rock filled the air. At the center of this solitude stood a house built decades ago, its paint peeled by sun and time, its windows shut tight against the desert's voice. Inside, Margaret Lane moved like someone who had learned to live with ghosts. Margaret was 62, tall and thin, with sharp cheekbones and silver hair pulled back in a neat braid. Her skin, once porcelain smooth, now carried the creases of loss and sun. She had been a military nurse for over 25 years, the kind who stitched wounds with precision and endured the chaos of war with unshakable calm. But nothing in her career had prepared her for the slow ache of losing her husband. Martin Lane had vanished during a classified desert mission 5 years ago. They told her he was Ganino body, no belongings, just a brief phone call and a folded flag. Since then, Margaret had lived alone in the same house they once shared, with only the wind and sand for company. That evening, she stood by the screen door, one hand on the frame, watching the horizon turn a deeper shade of ochre. She was about to shut the door when something moved, something low and quiet. Her eyes narrowed. From the edge of the scrubland, limping out of the dancing dust, came a bobcat. He was no more than 3 feet long, from nose to tail, his tawny fur matted with blood and dirt. His frame was thin, bones showing through a once powerful body. His right foreleg carried a scabbed-over wound, deep but healing. What struck her most weren't his injuries, it was his eyes. Amber, intense, and locked on hers with a knowing stare that unsettled her to her core. Margaret had seen bobcats before, usually fleeing or snarling from a distance. This one didn't growl, didn't flee. He stopped at the foot of her porch, barely 3 steps away, then collapsed slowly onto the worn wood slats, his breath shallow but steady. Her first instinct was caution, but another emotion pushed forward curiosity, tinged with recognition. There was something familiar in how he held himself, even in pain. Margaret fetched a shallow dish of water and set it near the porch's edge. She didn't touch him. She didn't speak. She just sat by the doorway, arms folded, and watched the sun fall behind the hills. That night, the wind picked up, moaning through the mesquite and ocotillo trees, and Margaret left the porch light on. She found herself pausing every few minutes to glance out the window, expecting what exactly? She wasn't sure. The bobcat remained curled in a patch of light, his breathing slow, his tail flicking now and then. When the desert quieted down, so did she. She slept uneasily, her dreams flickering with fragmented memories of Martin's voice, uniform, and the way he used to read maps late into the night. Morning brought with it a sky of cloudless blue and a chill that clung to the stones. Margaret stepped outside with her cup of black coffee, more habit than need, and immediately saw that the bobcat was still there. But something was different. Next to him, resting gently against the porch post, was an old canvas satchel. It looked military olive drab, frayed at the edges, the kind Martin had carried on field missions. She stepped closer, the boards creaking underfoot. The Bobcat raised his head but didn't move. He blinked slowly, then turned his gaze to the bag as if nudging her attention toward it. Margaret hesitated for only a second before kneeling down beside the satchel. Her fingers, though stiff with age, unbuckled the flap with practiced care. Inside, wrapped in dust-stained cloth, were three things: a metal badge bearing the name M, Lane, a partially burned scrap of map marked with coordinates, and an old-fashioned micro-cassette recorder, the kind used in the early 2000s. The badge was heavy in her hand, cool to the touch. The name etched into it struck her like a bullet. Martin's. Her throat tightened. She turned back to the Bobcat, who now sat upright, watching her with unwavering calm. It didn't make sense. No wild animal carried things like this. No animal found things like this. Unless it was something else entirely. Something trained. Something sent. The recorder was weathered but intact. Margaret turned it over in her hand, heart pounding. The buttons were stiff but functional. She didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, she stood slowly, the wind catching the hem of her robe. The desert stretched out before her, sun rising in fierce glory over the ridges. She looked down at the Bobcat again and whispered, "Where have you been?" The creature blinked, then rested his head back down. There was a faint scar along his left jaw, healed but unmistakable. Margaret recognized the pattern not natural. It looked like a surgical tag. Her mind reeled with questions, but above all, one truth rang loud. This was no ordinary Bobcat. He was a witness, a messenger, and perhaps in some strange way, a soldier. That morning, Margaret did not call animal control. She did not notify the authorities. Instead, she carried the satchel inside, placed it gently on the kitchen table, and poured herself another cup of coffee. Outside, the Bobcat remained, like a sentinel at the gates. And inside her, a door that had long been closed was beginning to creak open. The cassette recorder sat on the table like a relic from another life, its plastic casing yellowed by age, the play button chipped at the corner. Margaret Lane stood over it, her hand resting on the worn wood surface as if grounding herself. The house was unusually quiet, save for the occasional creak from the desert winds pressing against the windows. Outside, the Bobcat hadn't moved. He lay stretched across the porch, eyes half-lidded but alert, his tail twitching at irregular intervals like a ticking clock. Margaret didn't want to press play alone. She reached for the landline mounted on the wall, an old rotary phone Martin had insisted on keeping, despite the advance of modern technology. The line crackled before connecting. She dialed slowly, every digit dragging her deeper into the unknown. 3 rings, then a voice answered. "Turner Residence," came the familiar rasp. "Ryan, it's Aunt Margaret. I need you to come by, today." There was a pause. "Is everything all right?" "No," she said simply, her voice firmer than she expected. "But I think it will be if you come." An hour later, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the dry morning air. A dusty white Jeep pulled up beside the porch. Ryan Turner, her late sister's son, stepped out and adjusted his hat against the sun. He was 36, with a lean, athletic build and wind-reddened skin from years working as a U.S. Border Patrol officer. His face was sharp, with deep-set blue eyes and a jaw that rarely smiled but always observed. He carried a presence of quiet authority, shaped by the solitude of long desert patrols and the weight of seeing too much. Margaret met him at the door. "Thank you for coming." "You said it was urgent," Ryan replied, eyeing the Bobcat with a mix of surprise and caution. "Is that safe?" "I'm not sure," she said, "but I think he's here for a reason." They stepped inside. Margaret led him to the table, where the recorder and contents of the satchel were spread out. Ryan's brow furrowed when he saw the badge. "Is that?" "It's Martin's," she said, "and this was with it." She pressed the play button. The cassette sputtered to life, emitting a burst of static, then a faint voice laced with interference. "Lane, this is Martin Lane. If you're hearing this, something's gone wrong. Tram 17 was not what they told us." Ryan leaned in, his expression hardening. The tape continued, broken and crackling. "They brought in something, not an insurgent. Something else. Not human. Biomodded, experimental. It escaped. We weren't equipped. I told them. I told Wallace. He—" The tape cut off, then resumed a moment later, weaker. "If I don't make it, someone has to know. They'll try to bury this. The Bobcat's not just an animal. He's part of it. He remembers. He sees—" Then silence. The tape clicked to a stop. For a long moment, neither spoke. Ryan finally broke the quiet. "Is this a joke? Some old mission theater?" "No," Margaret said softly. "I know his voice. That's Martin. And that's not just some stray outside." Ryan's skepticism faltered, replaced by something colder. He looked again at the Bobcat through the window now, standing and watching them. "Did he bring this to you?" "He did," she said. "And he's not leaving." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had when processing something uncomfortable. "I've heard whispers, years ago, about a classified site east of Herold Army Research Base, shut down after some kind of containment failure. No one talks about it, but Tram 17, that name rings a bell." Margaret took a slow breath. "Then we need to find it." "You realize what you're saying?" he asked. "This could be dangerous." "So could silence," she answered. That night, the air turned cold. Wind swept through the low desert shrubs, sending brittle tumbleweeds rolling across the road like phantoms. Inside, Margaret lit a fire in the hearth, the orange glow dancing across the floor. The Bobcat, still unnamed, sat beside it, curled but unblinking. Margaret sat across from him, a cup of tea trembling slightly in her hand. "You were there," she whispered. "Weren't you?" The Bobcat looked up, meeting her eyes. He didn't blink, he didn't growl, but the weight in his gaze was undeniable. This was no wild creature. This was a witness, a relic, a soldier of a forgotten war. Ryan stayed in the spare bedroom that night, unable to sleep. He sat up reading the printed label on the cassette, Operation Granite Echo. Below that, in faded ink, classified, do not duplicate. Somewhere out there, in the dark expanse of sand and rock, lay the truth about what happened to Martin Lane. And now, they weren't just chasing rumors. They had a voice, a map, a guide with claws and scars. And the wind, once hollow and distant, now whispered something urgent through the cracked eaves of the house. The moon hung low over the desert, swollen and yellow, casting a cold glow on the endless sea of sand and rock that stretched beyond the headlights of Ryan's Jeep. The dirt road had long since faded behind them, replaced by scattered shrubs and jagged stone. Margaret Lane sat in the passenger seat, the satchel with the badge and tape resting on her lap. The Bobcat lay in the back, silent but alert, his ears twitching at every shift in the wind. His name still hadn't been spoken, but something in the way he carried himself made it feel as if he didn't need one. He had purpose. The map fragment they'd recovered had led them east of Dry Creek, past abandoned mining shafts and broken fencing, toward a place locals only mentioned in passing. No official signs remained, but Ryan knew they were close. The area had once been part of a restricted military testing zone, later decommissioned without explanation. But nothing in the desert ever truly disappeared. It just got buried deeper. Ryan brought the Jeep to a stop near a shallow rise of red stone, his boots crunching over cracked soil as he stepped out. He scanned the area, flashlight in hand, before helping Margaret down. She moved slowly, her body stiff from age, but her eyes sharp with determination. The Bobcat leapt from the back seat with effortless grace, landing without a sound, then trotted ahead through the sagebrush, his body low and fluid, like a shadow in motion. "There," Margaret whispered, pointing to a cluster of half-buried concrete blocks, half a football field away. They looked like the remnants of a structure, perhaps a foundation long overtaken by sand and neglect. They approached in silence, the only sound the wind dragging grit across stone. The bobcat stopped suddenly, nose low to the ground, and began pawing at a patch of disturbed earth. Margaret's heart pounded as she moved beside him. The sand was looser here, darker, and smelled faintly of metal and decay. Ryan knelt, brushing away layers of dust and debris with gloved hands. After a few minutes of digging, his fingers hit something hard. He paused, glanced at Margaret, then uncovered the corner of a rusted metal box. They worked together to pull it free. The box was heavy, sealed with an old military clasp that took effort to open. Inside, time had warped everything: photographs curled with moisture, papers yellowed and brittle. But what lay beneath the documents stopped Margaret cold. Bones. A partial skeleton, wrapped in what remained of a military field jacket. Boots still laced, dog tags buried beneath the collar. Ryan carefully removed them, brushing away dirt to reveal the name. Carl D. Price, he read aloud. Serial matches. This guy was listed as MIA 6 years ago. Margaret took the dog tags in trembling hands. That's not Martin, she whispered. But this was someone who served with him. Ryan turned back to the box, pulling out a sealed envelope marked "Confidential, not to be filed." Inside was a dossier, a redacted mission log, and a photocopy of a clearance signature. Colonel Dean Wallace. He whistled softly. This confirms it. Wallace signed off on a mission to Tram 17, but none of this is in the military's public record. This was buried. The bobcat sat quietly nearby, eyes fixed on the horizon as if guarding their moment. His presence no longer felt strange. He belonged here more than any of them. Margaret flipped through the dossier, her eyes narrowing. There's a mention of Subject Echo 6, behavioral anomalies, cross-species neural integration. She looked up at Ryan. That's not a man. That's an experiment. Ryan nodded grimly. And if this is Price, and he died out here, Wallace made sure nobody knew. Margaret felt a deep, aching cold in her chest. Martin tried to stop this. That message, he warned them. They reburied the remains with more care than the desert had shown, marking the grave with a circle of stones. Margaret placed the dog tags on top before whispering a prayer under her breath. Ryan took photographs of the site and the documents, then stashed everything into a dry bag. As they turned to leave, the bobcat moved ahead again, leading them back toward the jeep. But before they reached it, Margaret stopped, glancing back at the burial mound. She felt something watching them, not the bobcat, not Ryan. Something else, a presence just beyond the visible world. You feel that? She asked quietly. Ryan looked around, hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. We're not alone out here. They returned to the vehicle without incident, but the drive back was tense. Ryan kept glancing in the mirrors. Margaret clutched the satchel tighter. The bobcat curled in the back seat, breathing slowly, but keeping one eye open. As they reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, the town's dim lights on the horizon, Margaret whispered, "They left him out there to disappear, buried the body, buried the story." Ryan nodded. "But we just unburied it." The wind had changed. It no longer whispered over the desert, it hissed. The kind of wind that carries warnings instead of sand. The kind that made dogs bark and lights flicker. At Margaret Lane's isolated home on the edge of Dry Creek, that wind wrapped around the eaves like a whispering hand, tapping lightly at windows, knocking with purpose. Inside, Margaret sat stiffly on the couch, her eyes fixed on the bobcat curled by the fireplace. He seemed restless, tail twitching, ears rotating toward the door, as if he heard a sound no one else could. Ryan was at the kitchen table, sorting through the documents retrieved from the hidden grave. His knuckles were pale from how tightly he gripped a page marked Echo 6 Neural Response Log. He read the words over and over, unwilling to believe what they said. Neural mapping, aggression, suppression, failure, cross-species integration. These weren't terms from any standard military training he knew. A knock. 3 measured raps. The bobcat was on his feet before the final knock ended, fur bristling, a low, guttural growl growing from deep in his chest. Margaret rose slowly, glancing at Ryan. "That's not the wind." Ryan was already moving toward the door, hand near the revolver, tucked behind his belt. He peered through the curtain. A man stood outside, silhouetted in the porch light. Tall, lean, wearing a dark windbreaker zipped to the throat, his hair a precise gray that didn't move in the breeze. He was clean-shaven, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a black cap. He didn't flinch, didn't shift his weight. He stood like someone used to authority and unafraid of confrontation. Ryan opened the door a few inches. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Carter Wells, Department of Homeland Security." He held out a badge. Margaret stepped closer, squinting at the laminate. The photo matched the face. The badge was real, but there was something about the way he held it, like a threat more than a formality. Ryan didn't move. "What brings Homeland to Dry Creek?" Wells tilted his head slightly. "We're looking for a specimen. Escaped a containment program over a year ago. Highly dangerous, unpredictable, not safe around civilians." "You mean an animal?" "Not quite," Wells said, his voice flat. "Think of it as a project that should have been terminated, but it wasn't. Reports say it may have made its way to this region, possibly seeking out previous handlers or locations it remembers." Margaret stepped forward. "What exactly are you looking for?" Wells glanced past them into the house, then leaned in. "A bobcat, male, about 50 pounds, scar on the left jaw, moves like it's trained." Behind them, the bobcat let out a loud, unnatural snarl, his fangs bared. His hackles rose, and in a single leap, he slammed against the door, claws raking down the wood. Wells didn't flinch, but he took a step back, lips thinning. Margaret closed the door halfway. "We haven't seen anything unusual." "You sure about that?" Wells asked. "This creature isn't just a wild cat. It was part of a neural reflex enhancement trial military project, Echo 6, designed for desert warfare. But he went rogue, killed 2 handlers before disappearing." Ryan's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Sounds like you lost control of your experiment." Wells gave a small, condescending nod. "That's one way to phrase it." "Why now?" Margaret asked. "Why come after it after so long?" Wells' smile dropped. "Because it's no longer dormant. It's starting to remember, and that makes it a liability." He straightened. "If you see it, don't approach, don't feed it, and for God's sake, don't trust it." He stepped back off the porch. "I'll be in touch." The Jeep that picked him up was unmarked and dark green, its windows too tinted to see through. It drove off without headlights. Inside, the bobcat returned to the fireplace, still bristling, letting out one final hiss. When he turned toward Margaret, she could see a trace of fear in his amber eyes. No, not fear, recognition. Ryan pulled out a tablet from his duffel and loaded the flash drive again. Deep within the file structure, he found a hidden folder titled SEV-26 BioNotes. It was protected, but he bypassed the encryption with a military backdoor. The screen filled with charts, behavior logs, and then photographs. The bobcat, restrained in a steel chamber. Electrodes taped to his skull. A figure standing beside the enclosure, Colonel Dean Wallace. One video clip auto-played. In it, Martin Lane's voice echoed faintly. "This is unethical. Wallace, you're pushing him too far. He's not a machine. He reacts, he protects, he remembers." The video shook as Martin turned the camera on himself. "If anyone sees this, stop Wallace. Stop the program. That bobcat, he's not what they say. He's a survivor, and he's loyal." The screen faded to black. Ryan sank into the chair, stunned. Martin knew. He fought to shut it down. Margaret stared at the screen, then turned toward the bobcat. He was no longer watching the fire. He was watching her. "Then he came here," she whispered, "because he remembers who tried to protect him." By the following morning, the air felt different, charged, like a thunderstorm building behind the mountain ridge, though no clouds stained the horizon. Inside Margaret Lane's small desert home, the stillness was brittle. Ryan had just sent the encrypted files, including the footage of Colonel Wallace and Martin Lane's final testimony, to an independent journalist named Olivia Bransome, he trusted from a case years ago. Olivia was in her early 40s, sharp-tongued and relentless, with a reputation for exposing military abuse. She had short auburn hair, a steely stare, and the kind of voice that could cut through press briefings like a blade through paper. Within 10 minutes, she had replied, "I'll run it. Keep your doors locked." Ryan double-checked the locks anyway. Margaret moved slowly that morning, her body aching not from age, but from anticipation. She had brewed coffee, but barely touched it. She stood by the window, one hand resting on the frame, watching the bobcat, now affectionately called Ashu, lay near the edge of the porch, tail curled around him like a question mark. Though still silent as ever, there was a gentleness in how he watched her. In the glow of early sun, his fur shimmered like bronze dust. The scar on his jaw, a quiet echo of everything he had survived, seemed to define him. Ryan sat near the fireplace, gun disassembled on the table in front of him. "If they come," he said, "they won't come to talk." Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "They already know we have the truth. Now they'll try to bury it again." By nightfall, the silence had returned, but this time it was heavier weighted, like a held breath. They kept the lights low. The porch remained dim. Ash was alert, his ears angled to catch every disturbance, every scrape of wind. When the first sound came, it wasn't a knock. It was the soft crush of gravel beneath boots. Ryan moved to the window and pulled the curtain an inch aside. 3 figures, all in dark clothing, moved across the yard. One held what looked like a crowbar. Another carried a small case too square to be medical, too slim to be anything good. Margaret backed away slowly, guiding Ash behind her. He resisted, refusing to retreat. His pupils were wide, body low, every muscle a drawn string. Ryan whispered, "3 of them. They're coming fast." The first bang shattered the porch light. The second was a shoulder against the door. Ryan leveled his weapon, his jaw clenched. "You have 5 seconds to leave," he shouted. No answer. Another slam. Then silence. Margaret held her breath. Ash's growl deepened into a rumble, and then the window shattered as a man crashed through, rolling across the floor. He rose quickly, pulling a stun baton from his belt, but Ash was faster. The bobcat launched forward with terrifying precision, fangs bared, claws flashing. The man screamed as Ash clamped down on his forearm, dragging him across the wood floor. Blood smeared across the old rug. Another man burst through the door. Ryan fired once, hitting the attacker in the thigh. He went down with a cry, crawling backward toward the open doorway. The third figure hesitated, then bolted into the night, disappearing beyond the mesquite trees. The house fell still again, save for the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of Ash. He stood over the first man, who had gone silent. Blood pooled beneath the bobcat's hind leg. One of the attackers had slashed him with a serrated blade during the scuffle. The wound was deep, too deep. Margaret dropped beside him, hands shaking. "Ash, oh God," her fingers pressed gently against his side, trying to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, sweetheart, please." Ash looked up at her, his golden eyes soft and steady. He blinked once, slowly, deliberately, as if saying, "I did what I was meant to do." Ryan ran for the med kit, muttering under his breath, "We need a vet, now." Within 30 minutes, Ash was in the back seat of the Jeep, wrapped in towels, soaked with his blood. Ryan drove, headlights cutting through the dark as Margaret pressed cloth against the wound. They reached the only emergency vet clinic in the region, a low-slung building with a flickering neon sign. The attending vet was a woman named Dr. NT1. Emily Rhodes, late 30s, sandy blonde hair in a messy bun, with the worn patience of someone who'd seen too many lost causes, but refused to stop trying. "He's not just a bobcat, is he?" she asked, as she examined Ash's leg. Margaret met her eyes. "No, but he's family." The surgery took hours. They waited. Dawn broke like a promise. Dr. Rhodes finally stepped into the waiting room, exhaustion in her eyes but a smile breaking across her face. He's going to make it. Tough little guy. Margaret wept silently, clutching Ryan's hand. The days that followed moved quickly. Olivia Brandt published the story, backed by video, photos, and interviews. Headlines swept across major outlets. Whistleblower Colonel faces court-martial after decade. Long cover-up. Exposed by family and one wild animal. Colonel Dean Wallace was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. More witnesses came forward. The Project Echo 6 became a word spoken aloud in government halls. Ash came home with stitches across his leg and a new scar to add to his story. But he walked with pride, his steps slow but sure. The town whispered of him now not as a predator, but as a protector. Margaret placed Martin's badge, Carl Price's dog tags, and Ash's first photo together in a frame above the fireplace. At dusk, Ash often sat beneath it, staring into the fire, as if still remembering, still guarding. He had no cage, no command, just instinct, and the truth. Sometimes, truth doesn't come in the form of words, but in the eyes of a creature who remembers pain, loyalty, and betrayal. Ash wasn't just a bobcat. He was a silent witness to humanity's darkest ambitions and a living reminder that instinct can lead where reason fears to go. In the end, it wasn't the government or the courts that brought justice. It was the wounded who refused to be forgotten, and the woman who dared to listen. The story teaches us that no voice is too quiet, no life too small, to matter in the pursuit of truth. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in loyalty, healing, and redemption. And if you're listening now, don't forget to follow, leave a comment, and join us next time on Fearless Paws, where every creature has a story, and every silence hides a purpose.